20 vehicles that tore apart the last fortress of the German Reich. This is their story. 43,000 of them were built before the war ended. The T-34-85 emerged from the brutal lessons of Kursk, pairing a proven hull with an 85mm gun capable of defeating the Panther at combat ranges. It was fast, mechanically forgiving, and simple enough for crews trained in weeks rather than months. At Berlin, T-34-85s led virtually every assault column, absorbing punishment on rubble-choked streets while infantry sheltered in their shadow. The tank that saved the Soviet Union became the tank that finished Germany. German defenders feared its gun more than any other weapon rolling toward Berlin. The IS-2 Model 1944 carried a 122mm cannon that could punch through a Tiger at 1,500 meters and reduce a reinforced building to gravel with a single high-explosive round. Derived from the KV lineage but radically leaner, it weighed 46 tons yet moved with purposeful aggression. Soviet crews called it the Beast Killer. At sea-low heights, IS-2 battalions cracked the outer defense belt the Wehrmacht had spent months preparing. Where walls stood, the IS-2 made doors. It arrived too late to fire a single shot in anger at Berlin, yet changed tank design for a generation. The IS-3 featured a revolutionary pike nose hull and hemispherical turret so well sloped that Western engineers studying captured examples after the war immediately rethought their own programs. Development accelerated after Kursk revealed the cost of flat armor. Only a handful reached Soviet units before German surrender, but their presence in the victory parade through Berlin on May 9th sent a message every Allied observer understood immediately. The future had arrived wearing Soviet markings. Precision was its weapon. Built on the IS hull and carrying the same 122mm gun as the IS-2, the ISU-122 was designed to engage enemy armor from long range before closing to support infantry through urban terrain. Over 4,000 were produced, giving Soviet commanders a self-propelled anti-tank capability that the Germans struggled to answer. At Berlin, ISU-122 batteries positioned themselves at street intersections, dominating sightlines and discouraging any armored counterattack. Where the IS-2 brawled, the ISU-122 calculated. It killed with patience. Soviet troops simply called it the Animal Slayer. The ISU-152 paired a massive 152mm Howitzer gun with the IS tank chassis, creating a weapon that could obliterate any German vehicle and bring down multi-story buildings in a handful of rounds. It was developed after the KV-2 proved too mechanically unreliable for sustained combat. Over 4,000 were produced. Berlin placed extraordinary demands on it, as concrete office blocks in apartment fortresses required demolition firepower rather than finesse. Every urban assault group wanted ISU-152s at the front. When one fired in a narrow street, the overpressure alone knocked men off their feet. Crews had a name for it that politely translates as bare backside, referencing the open-topped fighting compartment that left them exposed to shell splinters and weather alike. Yet the Su-76M was produced in greater numbers than any other Soviet armored vehicle except the T-34, with over 14,000 built. Based on the T-70 light tank chassis, it gave infantry divisions their own mobile artillery that could keep pace on foot and provide direct fire support through narrow streets. At Berlin, it served as the workhorse gun that cleared snipers from windows and machine gun nests from basements. Unglamorous work done by an unglamorous machine that won anyway.
Obsolescence came fast in the war on the Eastern Front. The Su-85 was developed in 1943 specifically to counter the Panther and Tiger at ranges beyond 1,000 meters, entering service just months after those German tanks began appearing in strength. By 1945, its 85mm gun had been surpassed by the guns on the T-34-85 and the heavier ISU series. Still, roughly 2,000 remained in service and performed creditably in Berlin, engaging armored vehicles and strong points where their fully enclosed casemates offered better crew protection than the Su-76M. It solved the problem it was built for, then kept fighting the next one.
Nothing rolling out of Germany in 1945 could survive a hit from this weapon at any practical combat distance. The Su-100 mounted a 100mm gun that generated higher muzzle velocity than the ISU-122 while sitting on the lighter T-34 chassis, making it faster and easier to position. Development began after studies showed the Su-85 struggling against frontal Panther armor. Nearly 3,000 were completed before the German surrender. Soviet commanders deployed them as tank destroyers and direct-fire artillery at Berlin, where their flat trajectory made them ideal for engaging targets along rubble-flanked streets. It was the sharpest knife Soviet armor produced. A paradox drove its creation. The Soviet Union desperately needed light tanks while simultaneously knowing light tanks were dying on every front. The T-70 was designed to be simple, using two truck engines coupled together to reduce manufacturing strain during the crisis years of 1941 to 1942. Over 8,000 were built. By Berlin, its two-man crew and 45mm gun were thoroughly outclassed in direct combat, but the T-70 remained useful for reconnaissance, flank screening, and liaison between infantry units moving through destroyed city blocks. It had survived its own obsolescence through sheer production numbers. Sometimes quantity outlasts quality. 12,000 kilometers from Detroit, American steel fought under Soviet banners in the streets of Berlin. The M4A2 was the diesel-engined Sherman variant shipped to the USSR under Lend-Lease, and Soviet tankers generally respected its reliability and spacious interior, even while criticizing its tall silhouette. The Red Army received over 4,000 M4A2s and used them extensively in the 12,000 kilometers from Detroit. American steel fought under Soviet banners in the streets of Berlin. The M4A2 was the diesel-engined Sherman variant shipped to the USSR under Lend-Lease, and Soviet tankers generally respected its reliability and spacious interior, even while criticizing its tall silhouette. The Red Army received over 4,000 M4A2s and used them extensively in the final campaigns. At Berlin, Soviet Sherman units operated alongside T-34-85s, their crews appreciating the radio equipment and internal volume that Soviet tanks often lacked. Alliance built the weapon. Soviet hands drove it to the Reichstag. The sound preceded the destruction by several seconds, a shrieking moan that German troops called Stalin's organ, and that no amount of familiarity made less terrifying. The BM-13 Katyusha fired 16 132mm rockets in under 10 seconds, saturating an area with fragmentation and blast that no individual artillery piece could replicate. Mounting the launcher on the American Studebaker US6 Truck gave it the cross-country mobility Soviet roads demanded. At Berlin, Guards mortar units fired coordinated mass salvos to suppress defenders before each major assault. The psychological effect complemented the physical one. It did not aim at soldiers, it aimed at will. 36 centimeters of diameter and nearly 100 kilograms of rocket, the BM-13-12 fired weapons that dwarfed anything the standard Katyusha carried. Nicknamed Andryusha by Soviet troops, this 12-rail launcher hurled M31 heavy rockets against fortifications that lighter systems simply could not reduce. It was developed specifically because the 132mm Katyusha lacked the blast weight to demolish reinforced concrete positions. At Berlin, Andryusha batteries targeted the massive flak towers and government bunker complexes that conventional artillery struggled to crack. Massive, destructive, necessary. It answered questions that no smaller weapon could even ask. Produced in larger numbers than any other artillery piece in Soviet history, over 48,000 were manufactured during the war. The ZIS-3 was a masterpiece of industrial logic. Its components were engineered from the start for mass production, and it combined anti-tank and field artillery roles. In one lightweight carriage, a single artillery team could manhandle through debris. At Berlin, ZIS-3 batteries were attached directly to assault groups, dragged by hand up staircases and through breached walls to engage strongpoints from floors above or below. Its versatility made it indispensable in conditions where vehicles could not go. Wherever troops went, the ZIS-3 went with them. 1,500 of them supported the Berlin operation, firing a shell that weighed more than most soldiers could lift. The ML-20 was a heavy howitzer gun capable of both high-angle and direct fire, giving Soviet artillery commanders extraordinary flexibility. It had been the primary long-range weapon used to systematically reduce German defenses from Stalingrad onward. At Berlin, ML-20 batteries registered on specific building complexes days before infantry assaults, methodically collapsing floors and detonating ammunition stored inside. The weapon was not precise by modern standards. At 152 millimeters, it did not need to be. It made precision irrelevant. Thousands of armored vehicles were stopped permanently by a weapon its crews could push with human hands. The BS-3 entered service in 1944 as a response to the increasing armor thickness of late-war German tanks, firing a 100mm armor-piercing round at over 900 meters per second. It could defeat any German tank in service at ranges exceeding 1,000 meters. At Berlin, BS-3 batteries were positioned to cover approach routes and counter any armored breakthrough attempt by German forces attempting to relieve the city. Its presence at key choke points discouraged sorties that might otherwise have been attempted. The gun that Berlin never had to fire still won. Air defense on the move was a problem the Red Army only partially solved by 1945. The ZSU-37 placed a 37mm automatic cannon in an open-top turret on the Su-76M chassis, giving armored columns self-propelled anti-aircraft coverage as they advanced. Production was limited. Fewer than 150 were completed before the war ended, making them rare even at Berlin. Those present were deployed to protect headquarters areas and key bridge crossings from the Luftwaffe ground attack aircraft, which remained a threat even as German air power collapsed. It was never built in the numbers its designers intended. The numbers they did build still mattered. Command decisions that moved armies traveled in this vehicle. The GAZ-67 was the Soviet answer to the American Jeep, a lightweight four-wheel drive utility vehicle that carried officers, couriers, forward artillery observers, and communication equipment across terrain that would stop conventional vehicles.
Roughly 92,000 were produced during the war using domestically available components to reduce dependence on Lend-Lease supply lines. At Berlin, GAZ-67s threaded through rubble paths, delivering orders and evacuating wounded where larger vehicles could not maneuver. Every breakthrough depends on communication. Every communication at Berlin had a vehicle keeping it moving. That vehicle was usually this one.
Without it, the Soviet war machine stops. Over 100,000 Studebaker US6 trucks reached the USSR through Lend-Lease, and Soviet logisticians credited them as the single most important foreign contribution to their war effort. Six-wheel drive and high ground clearance gave the US6 mobility across roads destroyed by years of combat and spring thaws. At Berlin, Studebaker convoys pushed ammunition, fuel, food, and bridging equipment forward around the clock to sustain the massive assault. Soviet Marshal Zhukov himself acknowledged the truck's role in enabling the speed of advance the Berlin operation demanded. Guns fire bullets, trucks win wars.
Rugged, simple, and everywhere, the ZIS-5 was the backbone of Soviet military logistics before Lend-Lease deliveries could fill the gap. Based on a pre-war commercial design, it was deliberately simplified in 1942 by removing the passenger door and replacing welded components with bent sheet metal to accelerate production under wartime conditions. Over 500,000 were built in various configurations throughout the conflict. At Berlin, ZIS-5 trucks carried infantry forward, towed light artillery, and served as improvised ambulances and command vehicles. It was the truck that held the Soviet supply system together during the darkest years. Without the ZIS-5, there is no advance to Berlin at all.
Speed and a light machine gun were all it carried, yet the BA-64 performed tasks that neither tanks nor infantry could accomplish as efficiently. This compact two-man armored car was designed in 1941 and drew on captured German SD-KFZ-221 vehicles for inspiration in its sloped armor layout. Nearly 10,000 were produced. At Berlin, BA-64s operated with reconnaissance detachments pushing ahead of main columns to identify defended positions, locate crossings, and maintain contact between units separated by rubble. Their light armor stopped small arms. Their mobility stopped them from needing heavier protection. The eyes of the Soviet assault, they saw Berlin fall first.
20 vehicles. 20 different answers to the demands of the most complex urban battle the world had ever seen. From the IS-2 battering open fortified intersections to the Studebaker truck hauling the shells that made each assault possible, the Soviet war machine at Berlin was a system where every component mattered. The armor got the glory. The guns, trucks, and rocket launchers made the armor possible. Berlin fell on May 2, 1945, because all 20 of these machines worked together. That is how wars of this scale are actually won.